Hi, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the Guilt-Free Book Club, where we're going to continue our read of Grading for Growth, a guide to alternative grading practices that promote authentic learning and student engagement in higher education. Very honored today to have Mel and Mami as our special guests, and we'll get to hear more about them in a sec. I'll just introduce kind of where we are in the arc of the book. So the book has three sections, and we have three meetings. The first one was what is alternative grading in the first place. I'm delighted to see Jeremy Wachter here again. He was our special guest for the first session. This session is the biggest chunk of the book, which is what alternative grading can look like, where our authors dive deep into lots of different examples and case studies of different faculty all over the country who are using, in particular, standards-based grading and specifications grading systems and kind of adapting them in a lot of different ways for different settings, hybrid classes, large classes, lab classes, etc. And also just, maybe doing a small section of their class in that way rather than doing the whole thing. So kind of ways to start small. And then our last section in 1 month is going to be making alternative grading work for you, how you can start small to think about how you might bring these strategies into your classroom. And we'll have a guest speaker from outside Wentworth, a thought leader in the field of alternative grading nationally, Katie Matini from Tufts. So very excited about that as well. As we get started, I just shared a link to our collaborative notes document, which I like to make for these sessions. I'll just show you and anyone who's watching this recording later what it looks like. So here we are on March 11th. If you scroll down to the March 11th meeting, you'll see this and some of the source texts and resources. I put in some chapter summaries. If you didn't get a chance to read as carefully, that's totally fine. You can take a quick look and get a sense of what each of the chapter holds and what some of the features of each of the classes that they studied, the case studies were. Mel and Mami, we're going to focus on specifications grading. So that's what we'll be looking at primarily, but definitely happy to talk about any of the cases. And then there's spots for some discussion questions and key takeaways, which is open to all of us to put in. So feel free to add to this document as you see fit. So with no further ado, I'd love to turn things over to the fabulous professors Mami Wentworth and Mel Henriksen of Applied Mathematics, who are going to tell us a bit about their experiences using specifications grading here at Wentworth. Take it away.
Thanks, Josh. Uh, we have a few slides that we wanted to share with you. I'll pull that up, and then Josh had mentioned maybe talking about sort of our origin story. So maybe before we start the presentation proper, we can talk about that. I want to say Math Fest maybe in 2018. And well, actually, before that, I'd been listening to a former colleague of ours, Emma Zabarsky, talk about her interest in standards-based grading. So anyway, I was at a conference and I'd gone to listen to a particular talk. I don't remember what it was, and I had nothing to do for the next few minutes, so I just sat in the same room. And the next presentation was on specs-based grading, and I was kind of riveted. So then I mentioned this to Mami, and she got kind of interested in it, and so we bought Linda Nilsson's book and read it, and that was kind of how we got into it. Linda Nilsson actually wrote the foreword, I think, to the book that we're reading. So anyway, that's kind of how we got into it, and then we just got sucked in.
Well, so the next 15 minutes or so, maybe shorter, we thought we will share our experience using it, starting with what specs grading is, the version that we employ. And back in 2020, we want to share a little bit of the results from that research study. And then we share how students are responding to this type of grading scheme. So what is specs grading? Maybe you heard terms like mastery-based grading, standards-based grading. I think it's in the same family of that. But for specs grading, we have a list of specifications that students need to master. So the course grade is mostly based on how specs students have mastered. And typically, each spec is graded with either mastered or not yet mastered. And students usually have multiple opportunities to show mastery on these specifications. So on the right, this is one of the documents we provide to our students. We list clearly what the topics are, where it's covered, and what the specs are, so the students know exactly what they need to do. And we use this for our differential equations class, Math 2500, typically taken by sophomores and juniors. So for example, the first, actually spec number 2 is solve first order separable equation by separating. It's one of the things that students will need to do. As Mel mentioned, we started this journey back in 2018. That's when we were really inspired. We did a lot of prep work. We created the specs, rubrics for each spec, the explanation documents for students, all of that. That happened in 2018. 2019 in the spring, that's when we first employed specs grading. That first semester was lots of nightmare. Lots of grading, late night grading, like on a daily basis. And but I'm glad we didn't give up because we made it, I feel like made it more doable. And then 2020, we collaborated with our colleague at U Portland, and we did a study on how this grading scheme affects students' testing anxiety. We'll share that results later. And then we continue to evolve our own version. We made changes that makes it doable for us and also help students learn. And we've been using that current model since around 2023. And we continue to use specs grading for this class, 2500.
So the current form that we use, we have 32 specs. 27 of them are concept or process specs tied directly to the material in the course. And then the remaining 6, one is attendance, student attendance to the class, and 2 are projects, and then 3 are the homework for the course. So we assess the students' understanding and mastery of the specs in class with 5 different assessments, and we repeat once questions on the specs each time. So the first assessment we give has the first 5 specs of the course, and then the second assessment has the next 6 specs plus different questions that cover the first 5 specs again. So students have an opportunity to answer those questions if they need to. We grade using partial credit on a 0 to 4 point scale, and we'll talk about how we evolved into that in a couple minutes. And then the course grade is 80% based on the specs. So whatever the student average is on their score for all the specs in the course, that makes up 80% of the course grade, and then the other 20% is from the common final. So we tried a number of things and jettisoned them along the way. We first started out having 6 mandatory specs, and we found that it was just really hard to. It didn't seem appropriate to not pass students based on not having done some of these mandatory specs. It didn't seem to make sense once we dove into it. So we eliminated that. We started out with no partial credit, and we did that for a number of years. But students really, I don't know, the feedback we got was that it was demotivating for students. For us, we were kind of wrestling with, well, does the student get credit? Does the student not get credit? Well, if they maybe if they really understand this, we should give them credit, and we kind of negotiate with the student and discuss things with them. It just from both our standpoint and the student standpoint, it wasn't working for us. So we went to the 4 point scale I mentioned. We used to do retakes outside of class time. We would schedule all kinds of retake times during the week. And either, Mami students can come to my session, my students go to her session. But it was just really logistically difficult. So we kind of consolidated into just having assessments and retakes during class time. And we started out with no deadline. So students could take, a retake for spec one, like the day before the final. And again, it was just logistically horrible. So we kind of clamped down on that. The other problem with that too is that students would procrastinate. They'd always think, well, I have another chance. I have another chance. I have another chance, until at the end, they didn't have any more chances. And then we emphasized the importance of the final exam, because we didn't want to encourage students to just kind of cram and then forget. So we wanted them to retain the information, obviously preferably long term, but certainly through the end of the course, through the final. So we initially graded on paper, but we moved to Gradescope 4 or 5 years ago. And so we grade on Gradescope. We download the grades from Gradescope to Excel. We do the calculation of the max of the retakes to get the student's current or final spec score, and then we upload that to those data to Brightspace, so that on Brightspace the student can see their score for each spec, as well as their overall standing in terms of the average of their scores for all the specs that they've taken.
So we like it. And then a big reason for liking this is because we encourage our students to have a growth mindset. And we think this grading scheme supports that students can learn from mistakes and, don't give up. I can do it. I just haven't learned it yet. I can do it. That mentality. Also, because every spec is out of 4 points, we can finish grading pretty quickly and gives feedback to students, and allowing them to come talk with us, or figure out on their own and prepare for the follow-up assessment. Also, as you saw, we list the specifications pretty clearly, explicitly, what you need to learn. So it's clear to both faculty and students and what the expectations are. Earlier we mentioned about the research we did. This we did with our colleague. At the time he was at University of Portland. And we asked the students to rank their anxiety related to this course. And at both Wentworth and at University of Portland, we had students in classes that employ specs-based grading and students in traditional grading courses. And the result is that the students who are in specs grading classes, they reported reducing amount of anxiety as the term went on. This is a quote from our paper. SVG center-based grading has been found to markedly decrease students' self-reported anxiety related to the course as compared to traditionally graded courses. And we hypothesized that it's because students had multiple opportunities. They knew that, once they get really bad grade, it wasn't the end of it. They can do it again. They can improve their grades, and that helped them feel less nervous about exams. Exams became less high stake as traditional, courses where you had 1 or 2 midterms and the final exam.
So we solicit feedback from students most terms, and here's some representative comments from students. This one student thought that the idea of having the retake was great. Being able to know I can still master the material if I struggle the first time. Sometimes I'm having a bad day on test day, that kind of thing. And then the thing that Mami alluded to earlier about the clarity of defining the specs in terms of what students know. The students said being able to clearly know what the topic we're covering is, and being able to tell how the lessons are separated. So just kind of the definition of the specs kind of help the students see the organization of the course and the material. And then another student said, well, it made sure you learn the process instead of copying it. I like to think of this as a sort of ode to deep learning. I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but hopefully there's something there about that. And then, following on with the paper that Mami just discussed, the students said, well, it's less stressful because, we're allowing for improvement. And then another student said, well, I wasn't worried about my grade. I was just focusing on learning and understanding the material. It's almost like the students writing to give me what I want to hear. I don't know, but hopefully there's some sincerity here. And then another student said, at first I was quite worried about it, but once we started taking them, the specs and the assessments, I realized that I preferred them to an actual test. Having smaller assessments made it easier to prepare, and there was less material for assessment. So again, I think this idea of allowing retakes, students kind of warm to it. And initially, students are a little bit confused when we present this on the first day, but by the time the first assessment rolls around and they see how it works, generally students are on board. In fact, when we ask students, did you feel like you learned better or learned more in this class with specs grading compared to your experience with a more typical grading scheme in other math classes? 3/4 of the students agreed with that statement, that they felt that, yeah, it was working for them. So we thought that was encouraging. So the references here are just the Linda Nilsson book that kind of informed us on how to approach specs grading. Again, Linda Nilsson wrote the foreword to the book that you all are reading. And then this is the paper that Mami had discussed earlier. Thanks a lot. So Josh had talked about having a discussion question. We actually didn't prepare a discussion question, but maybe if anyone has questions or comments about what we shared, or have similar experiences or experiences with standards or specs grading, or not.
Well, first of all, let me just jump in before we jump into it and thank Mel and Mommy for putting together such a thoughtful presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. Very impressive and wonderful to hear about your trajectory and both, the things that worked and the things that didn't and how you learned from it. So I'm sure we'll have a rich discussion just based on what you shared. And let's start off with Gabe.
Hello, good morning. Okay, yeah, I have two questions. Maybe I'll give other folks background. I mean, Mel and Mommy already know this because I've been talking about this at curriculum committee meetings. I do a lot of the same-ish thing in discrete math, and I'm expanding it more and more. And I was gratified to see, like, oh yeah, you tried this and then you decided not to do that. And there a lot of those things I either tried or considered and also didn't continue with for basically the same reasons. So the two questions I had, the first was, what does your mapping from exam problems to specs look like? So in other words, like does each exam problem cleanly map to one spec, or is it multiple specs sometimes?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a 1-to-1, with the exception of the final. So DBQ has differential equations has a common final across all sections. Not everyone is doing specs grading. Some people are doing it, but a little bit differently than what we do it. Other folks aren't. So what we do for that is we map. So we give the fifth and final assessment on the last day of the class meets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's not an opportunity in class to do the retake for the specs for that final assessment. So we map the questions that are appropriate to the appropriate specs from the final, and then there are left then some number of specs that aren't on the final, right? So we the last, I don't know, 3-4 years we've done a supplement and we give the supplement to students after the final exam. Now, the final exam for DiffyQ up until last spring, I think, was the final exam period. So we told students this is what's happening, and we had the time to do that.
My take on your question was a little bit different, Gabe. I don't know if that answered, but one of the issues with one-to-one mapping is that we eliminate this idea of like for differential equations, for those of you who know, we have different ways of solving the differential equations, and we have to tell them exactly which method to use because that's what the spec is. So to combat that, we created a separate spec where students actually have to decide which method they would use, even if they might not actually solve it.
Right. You sort of decoupled the figure out how to okay. That makes sense.
This dilemma is brought up in the book, I think, that you're reading, in the chapter on specs grading.
Yeah, that I'm definitely reading. Okay, great. The other question was on the 0 to 4 scale. So is that just kind of is it sort of like a holistic, like, they got it, they, sort of got it, or how do you do the partial credit exactly?
In a typical way. So we used to do, right, like, okay, holistically, do you get it? Do you not get it? That kind of thing. But with the feedback and the way we deal with the logistics, basically, if it's like an eigenvalue problem, if you can do eigenvalues, you get a point or something, right? If you
Yeah, okay. So typical kind of like milestone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, in discrete math, it turns out that most of the specs are like really atomic. That like you either kind of got it or you didn't, or it's like here are a bunch of relations, which ones are reflexive, and so it's just like basically a bunch of true/false questions. So like discrete math has been really easy to do specs based because there are very few problems that are like complicated multi-step, like how do I give partial credit things. But as I'm looking ahead to more and more of my classes and wanting to expand this, I'm trying to figure out how to do the same thing in other classes. So anyway, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great question. Thanks, Gabe. Samere.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mel and Mami, for preparing this spec grading, it looks interesting. But my question is, maybe you've talked about this in your presentation, but how would you compare the final grade, the final exam grade of students who were under the spec class with the traditional students? If you compare, is there any result that you got?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did some comparison early on. We haven't done it recently. And I don't know that I can really say that, oh yeah, specs grading really elevates the student success. There are certainly students who make use of the retakes, right? So that they certainly more students do better having the retakes than if we just took their first outing, right? Their first attempt. But whether that means that, I have some skepticism that the first attempt is representative of what would be the case if they didn't know they had the second attempt. So in one sense, we might be we might just be allowing students to have more flexibility, and some of that flexibility may be good, because students. I'm sure you've heard students come and say, "Well, I have another exam, and I'm stressed out about all this." So it does give them some flexibility in that regard, but I can't definitively tell you that we have a higher success rate based on using specs grading.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And just looking back at the subtitle of the book, Alternative Grading Practices that Promote Authentic Learning and Student Engagement. it's hard to measure those things uh, and hard to know. And sometimes, maybe the the idea, I guess, of the book is that what an A or a B represents in traditional systems doesn't actually necessarily mean that much, especially relative to what it means in other classes. Whereas with a system that's a little bit more specific like this, it actually is a bit more meaningful, and hopefully promotes learning that's deeper, as Mel said, and hopefully carries forward. And maybe if you talk to faculty who are teaching those same students in subsequent courses, maybe anecdotally you get a sense of like, oh yeah, the people who come out of that system do seem to remember more, but who knows? So great question. Dave, take it away.
Hi. There are two questions that I've got. One is about reducing student anxiety. Clearly, your graph shows that the specs-based grading has helped students to be less stressed about the assessments. I've done something similar over the years. I've gone from having midterm and final and then some projects to breaking up the course into typically 10 modules, and there's a module test for each. And the feedback that I've gotten is that greatly reduces the amount of stress for them. So I'm seeing something similar, though it's not specs-based per se. My question about the specs is, you then have a final exam. And I know that for myself as a student and for the feedback I've gotten from my students, having a midterm or a final is very stressful, particularly since it's the same time as they're getting final exams in all of their other classes. Have you considered whether there's an alternative to doing the final exam that might mesh well with the specs-based grading?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, part of it is that kind of what we do in the classroom up to the final exam. I mean, to a large extent is our decision. What happens at the final exam is not our decision, because we've as a faculty decided that certain courses have common final exams, so that there's some measurement across sections of student learning. So to do what you're asking about kind of requires changing that paradigm. So to be honest with you, I haven't thought, and I don't know if you've thought about it, but yeah, we haven't really thought about that. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
All right. Well, my second question hopefully is a little less interesting and easier to answer. How do you find if at all, the specs-based grading to map to the accreditation assessments?
We haven't thought of that. Math has never been part of accreditation. I guess that's changing. So that's something we will have to consider in the future.
I mean, I don't know how it will differ though. I mean, we cover the same material that we covered before we did specs grading. We just codified it a little differently. Yeah.
Right. My question is, do you think that with the specs-based grading, it will be easier to come up with a mapping from the results from the specs-based grading to whatever the accreditation standards are, whatever the items are that you're going to be using as part of the course assessment, the program assessment for accreditation purposes?
I think it'd be easier because there's mapping, right? Every assessment has like, okay, problem 1 maps to this, and 2 is this. So in that sense, yeah, I think it'll be simpler.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, because it sounds like each specification maps directly to one of the learning objectives. So it's already kind of laid out in that way that might be easy to transfer to an accreditation study. So that's great. Sanjay, take it away. Or wait, Mel, do you want to add something before we get
I have
Sanjay's
to say
question?
that what you said is actually correct. That table that we showed you that you couldn't read, in the first couple slides, where we list all the specs. We do actually map each spec to the learning objective, of course. So yeah, that's good point.
I have a quick comment too, actually, about the final exam thing that you kind of asked about, Dave, which is that at least my experience in discrete math is that my final exam problems in that class, and I'm typically coordinating that class in the fall, so I have the benefit of actually like I don't enforce on the other instructors that they have to run the same kind of like test retest paradigm that I do. In part because we have a lot of adjunct instructors, and I just sort of I want to give them a framework, but also not make them feel like that they have to use something that's a little bit possibly different from their experience. But in any case, the final exam problems, in my case, they all look like the problems that are on the tests and retests mostly. And so even though the final exam that we do is a fairly traditional final exam, students have had a chance to do those sorts of problems, to retake those sorts of problems, and then, in advance of the final, when we show them the review materials, I sort of make it clear, like, except for like the very new stuff that they haven't seen on a test yet, this is all stuff you've already, like, it's all the same skills you've already been tested on. So I hope that does some measure of sort of relieving anxiety while also providing a backstop to test some long-term retention, basically.
Thank you, Gabe. And by the way, Gabe, no guilt, no guilt, to your previous comment. Sanjay, take it away.
Hi, well, Mami, so thanks for the great refresher on specs grading. As you know, I've been thinking about that a lot these days. Question I had, or one question I had was, a lot of the specs seem to be mainly about things you can do within the, say, an exam period. You can do within a 5-10 minute period. You also have a few specs that are done through projects and homework. How does retakes work in those situations?
It doesn't. That's the concise response. The project, we just grade it and we prorate the 0 to 4 based on the percentage grade on the project. The homework, it's the same thing. Whatever the percentage grade is, we just scale that to the 0 to 4 scale, or 0 to 12, it's 3 specs. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Actually, I never thought about, is there a retake effort on that?
I think we did it one semester where we had a reject of a project and say, if you want to increase your grade, you can redo it. And that kind of aligned with the growth mindset. But these years, I think we kind of just grade it as is.
Yeah. I mean, it's a relatively small percentage of the overall grade. But yeah, that's an interesting point.
And another question I had was, so specs grading seemed to be like you have, I don't know, 30 specs, and to get an A grade, you need to, or 80% of your A grade, you need to hit a certain number of specs. How do you gauge that? Like, you try 25 and this seems to be overly strict, but if you say you need to hit 20 specs, then that would be a little too lax. So do you fudge how do you adjust the numbers, I guess?
So that's part of our evolution. We had different levels for, to get an A, right? Like you need 80 or more to get an A, stuff like that. But what happened was that it became really cumbersome. Like it was very complicated easily, and students couldn't figure out their own grades. We had to like really go back to the formula and calculate for them. So what we ended up doing is really like, if there are 27 of them, right? 90% of that, like align with the school grading system for A through, D, whatever, and then match the percentage. That way it's easy to compute, right? Like, okay, there has been 20 specs so far, you have 10 of them, or you have a 50% course grade, right? Like that's easier to compute. And so we end up doing that. And I think we like it better because it's easy to explain that, and then students can understand that easily as well.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, yeah, better than having the final be, calculate your final grade using calculus because as it's so complicated that you need that. So, and Sanjay, yeah, to your first question, in the book, there's a lot of examples of how, hybrid systems where some faculty will have, extensive retakes or multi-stage exams, multi-stage projects, draft, all sorts of feedback on certain things and not on others. And it's just kind of how you choose to design the class and what you're focusing on. So, great question. Sarah, take it away.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, this has been great. Well, I do love the idea of calculating your grade using calculus, even though it's probably not practical in real life. Maybe it'd be a fun activity. I was curious about the logistics of this. So, how big were your classes? Was it a large lecture class? And you also mentioned it helped you save some time on grading. So what did that look like in your day-to-day work? And hopefully fewer late nights.
Our class size is typically 25. It used to be a little bit larger, but they're capped at 25. So, sometimes we'll have one section, sometimes we'll have two sections each of us. We typically grade all our sections. So I'll grade spec 1, 2, and 3. Mami will grade spec 4, 5, and 6, or whatever. So that provides some consistency. It also, I don't have to change gears quite so much. I can know how I'm grading is great. So I think that streamlines things, and also I think provides more consistency for the students cross sections. I don't know, time wise. I was a little skeptical of going to the 0 to 4 because I thought it would create more work. Although I'm not sure that it does, not appreciably. Plus, we've cut down on the number of retakes, not so much to lessen the workload, but because we thought we had so many retakes that we thought we were encouraging students to procrastinate, and it was counterproductive. But the result is that, well, there's less grading.
Also, I think we used to give them retakes at any time they wanted, way. So then, week 7, I had one exam from, early on, and then 2 exams from just now, and then 3 exams from this. And it's just some of them you can just figure out, but some of them you just pull up the solution sheets and grade that person and then record this. And that was just not the right investment of the time time that we could be spending with students instead. So right now we have 5 exams in class, so it's a little bit more than typical class where you might have maybe 3 midterms at most in many lower level classes, except for calculus. So it's a little bit more, and we settled that number. We used to have 7 or 8 assessments, and we realized that also created anxiety problems because they felt like they were being assessed every week or every other week. So to me, this 5 assessments, smaller than typical but more frequent, I think is the happy medium that we've reached.
Thank you. Have you come across a kind of an optimal number of retakes, or does it sort of depend on the assessment?
Good question.
Okay, it might be a good future research question too.
Yes. We are actually still in the process of trying that out, what the optimum number is. What we did was we've done 2 retakes, in-class retakes, to 1 retake, but then we give you a retake on everything at the end of the term. But again, it's not always productive. Sometimes it's counterproductive to tell them that there's going to be additional retake. So that's the kind of balance we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Good questions. Dave, take it away.
I'm curious about the retakes. You give them the grade, obviously, for each of the assessments, do you give them feedback on what they got right, what they got wrong? Do you give them the solution set to each of the assessments? And if so, how meaningful is the retake if they have the answer available to them?
Oh, we have different questions for the retake. Same spec, different questions, yeah. And by now, we've been doing this so long that we have like this huge supply of questions we just kind of grab here and there from, previous exams and stuff. So yeah, it's different.
We've been paying attention to the kind of feedback we give, Dave, and so this year, more than previous years, I'm paying attention to like, okay, 4-point scale, right? Instead of like, you kind of got it, you get a 2. We would say, okay, you got this and this, and therefore you got 2 points. You lost points on this aspect of the problem. And I think I'm learning that it's better. I think there's research that shows that too. Although several years ago, I used to say, no, you go figure out what the error is because that's part of learning. And I learned that we think that's the good way to learn for students to learn, but students never learn that way. So instead, I'll tell them almost explicitly, right? These are the aspects that you need to work on.
But we do that within the rubric of grade scope. Right? There's very little annotation. It's mainly through the rubric. So we try to make the rubric fairly, fairly explicit, I guess.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Semere, take it away.
Thank you again. I was wondering if you guys can maybe share a sample of like the spec exam or like assignments and then the grading stuff. I don't know. If that's possible.
Absolutely, I have an example here.
We will hold it.
Okay.
I will walk over to the office.
Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, sure.
Yeah, assessment, rubric. I mean, grade scope. We do grade scope, but description, the logistics, explanation to students, the speech we give to students, and any of those things. If it's helpful, I'll be happy to share that with you.
Yeah, that image that we showed in one of the early slides is we used to have a separate document that explained all this stuff, and then we the last few terms we've tacked it on as an appendix to the syllabus, so we can say it's in the syllabus. But it lines out all the specs. It lines out the grading scheme. It lines out our rationale for why we do this stuff. All that. I have no idea if students actually read that stuff, but it's all in there available to you.
Before I kick it over to Dave, I want to ask a follow-up about that speech you give to students and just how that's evolved over the years and what you found really works to get their buy-in.
We started doing Dana Ernst first day, setting the stage. There's an activity called setting the stage, and we ask different questions to students and have them discuss in there, like how would one learn? What's the benefits of productive failure, things like that, and kind of get them to have this growth mindset. And I think we used to tack on to that kind of first day speech where like, okay, you're gonna see different grading scheme. That's because we think it complements this active learning that we do in class, right? Students learn by doing, as well as growth mindset that we want them to have. I don't exactly remember.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the spiel at the beginning revolves around both the active learning way that we conduct the class and the specs grading. The other thing, I don't know how relevant is this question, but the other thing I should mention is that the material that we use is material that it's a workbook that we wrote. And I can't remember now if we rewrote it with the specs in mind, but basically we highlight the specs at the beginning of each section that are covered by that section. So I can say, okay, the assessment on Wednesday is going to be on specs 6 through 8, which is covered in lessons 3.1 to 3.5, whatever. And so students, in that sense, you know, kind of the whole presentation of the material is organized by the specs.
Nice. And one follow-up on that is, I mean, we talked about the subtitle being student engagement. Obviously, active learning is student engagement. So what does active learning look like in your calculus classroom? And I guess how does that dovetail with this assessment system that is aiming to get more student engagement?
So I'll tell you how I do it. I think some slightly,
This is differential equations, but
yeah. But so we base a lot of what we do in terms of active learning on Wilgedal's research. Wilgedal is the guy that wrote
building thinking classrooms.
Yeah, building thinking classrooms, and we read a couple papers by him from I don't know 2010, 2011, where he shows research that students standing at vertical whiteboards tend to share more quickly than they do if they're writing on a permanent surface. The standing tends to get the students working together more readily. We find that, so I tell my students, okay, I'm going to have you work in groups at the whiteboard. We actually do random grouping too. So his thing is visible random grouping. The students know that it's random, right? So I have the students fill out a card with their name on it from a deck of cards, and then I shuffle it at the beginning of the class, and I deal out hands of 3, and those are the groups, right? And then we'll lecture for 15, 20 minutes on a good day. On a bad day, we talk too much. But on a good day, we'll lecture short period of time, and then have students work in the workbook at the whiteboard in groups of 3 or so. We try to get rooms where there are 3 surfaces, 3 walls covered with whiteboards. Barring that, we use the windows. And I tell students that I want them to work at the whiteboard for these reasons. I want them to work together. I want them to be on the same page. And when there's only one page and that's the whiteboard in front of them, it's easier to be on one page. I want them to be able to, everybody in their group, to see their work and to be a part of that work. But I also want them to be able to see the other group's work, right? It's not cheating to look at what the other group's doing and then ask yourself, they're doing something different, like what's going on? And it's not cheating to go and talk to them about it. And the other thing is that I can stand at one place in the room and I can look around and see where I think I ought to spend my time because I can see how the students are progressing. So that's a little bit about how we organize the working class and why we do it that way and why we think it's advantageous.
Nice. Thank you. That was really insightful and really interesting. Dave.
Purely logistical question. I'm looking into using Gradescope because I think it'll make my life a lot easier and significantly reduce the amount of time it takes for me to do grading. All of the module tests that I give are fully graded by Brightspace. They're true, false, and multiple choice questions. Most of the true, false are being phased out. But for the actual assignments, individual or group projects where they need to provide for my courses some code, I need to be able to run the code. So I actually need the code available to me. But in terms of giving them feedback, it's very cumbersome to try and do it outside a tool like Gradescope. For your assignments, do the students do the submissions to Gradescope, or do you upload their material?
We upload their material. We take pencil and pen paper exams.
Okay.
We will occasionally have students upload like assignments that are not the assessments. If we give, generally most of the homework in differential equations is on web work, it's online homework. But occasionally we'll give some other homework and we'll have students upload that directly. But the bulk of it, yeah, like Mami said, we do.
Well, I'll throw in one more question, which is about kind of the faculty experience. That I loved the subtitle of Lyndon Nelson's paper, "Saving Faculty Time," and it was kind of funny to hear that in conversation with how you described your initial attempts at this alternative grading system, which caused you a lot of late night grading, the opposite of saving faculty time. So as it's evolved and developed, have you found ways to save yourself time, or are you finding that maybe you're just using your time differently, and is that better, or how has it impacted your experience as a faculty member?
I think.
How do we change our time usage? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so in the beginning, it was not saving you time. It was the alternative system was taking more time. But you've stuck with it and you're still doing it and you're happy with it. So something must have changed. So what changed? Does it now actually save you time? Does it now actually take you less time than a traditional system? Or is your time just reallocated and actually, you're spending time in different ways with your students or as you plan
Yeah.
for and engage with the course than you would in a traditional system?
Yeah. So the way we started this, we attended the conferences and talked to lots of people who've done different ways of doing it. And some of the stuff, like the mandatory specs, there are people who do that mandatory specs, but when they said that be careful with this because you're gonna have a difficult time deciding who's gonna pass and who's gonna fail. And we said, no problem, we're gonna do it anyway. And then it was a disaster. So I think that the answer is it just takes different ways of doing even just specs grading. We say that with like one phrase, but it has different flavors. And for our students in differential equations class, whatever we decided doing, we're doing that works well, I think, for us and for students. But if it's calculus, it's different. When we did talk to people, there weren't many people who were doing specs grading in differential equations. This is typically common in maybe calculus and maybe proofs class, where students have to revise their writing and and get feedback and then make it better, stuff like that. But we adapted to this class, and yes, I think it has not only we got better at doing this, but I think it does save time in that like we got a system going and it's pretty straightforward. We're not spending time on things that we don't want to spend. Like we want to explain things to students, but we don't want to waste time explaining 10 times this complicated system that nobody can understand, right? So like those things we eliminated. So I think we eliminated wasting time on things that doesn't need to be spent on. And now we're spending time, like I think I mentioned earlier, like I have students coming after assessments that, let's go over what we did wrong and how can I make it better next time, because I want to make sure that I get this spec next time. And I think those are the attitude that we want students to have with this. And I think specs grading kind of allows that. Like, I think it has gotten better. But if you're trying new, we'll be happy to talk. But my only warning is that it will take time until you get going. Like the first semester, it's gonna be difficult because you think it's gonna work and it's not gonna work, right? Like you have to make changes as you do things. But we got to our happy place in like a couple of years later, so you will get there. It's possible.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I was just thinking about one of the case examples in the book where the professor has the same problem as you with I'm grading things from week 1 and week 8 and it's like too much. So she made a very specific system where it was like, oh, you can only resubmit for certain things at certain times, and that's it. So again, as Mami said, it will take time to figure out what system works for you. And in the book, the authors really argue for or advocate for starting small rather than like redesigning your whole class and trying it and it's gonna, you're gonna do a lot of late night grading and be fielding a lot of student questions that you hadn't thought about yet either. So in the last chapter of this section of the book, they talk about standards-based testing. So that's a way to kind of implement a standards approach just on certain assessments, rather than redesigning the whole class. But as always, obviously, speaking with your faculty colleagues who are already doing this is a great way of doing it. We have Jeremy Wachter, who was here before Mel and Mami. Sounds like Gabe's trying it also. I know Sanjay is interested. I just want to publicly thank you, Sanjay, for giving us the inspiration for using this book. It was your suggestion, so I'm so glad you're able to be here. And also, obviously, TLC is here to help if you want a thought partner, if you want to ultimately do research about, as Mel and Mami did, publish an article. We're here to help you with that process as well. So feel free to reach out. Any last questions, comments, or thoughts as we conclude?
I have one last comment. I think that the more we try this alternative grading scheme, easier it gets for students, so that it's not like a one-off. When they come to our class, it's like, oh, we're trying something new. Rather, I can say, oh, as you've seen in Professor Cunningham's class, right, we're gonna do something different. I think it just becomes the culture that way. So I like what we do, so I want others to try it too in their own versions. And I think the more of us we try, the better it is for all of us.
Love that as a last thought. Well, hopefully, as Sarah said, this will be insightful and inspiring to folks to try these things out, and lots of people here on campus, including us and everyone else in the room, who would be happy to help you as you start on this journey. Thanks again to Mel and Mami for being our special guests. Really insightful and awesome presentation. And I hope to see you back in a month. I'll follow up with an email, but it's April 8th, 12:30 to 1:30 on Zoom with nationally celebrated thought leader in this arena. So looking forward to that program and hope to see you there, if not before. Thanks again, y'all, and have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.